So we have a theme each year, sermon theme. And so a couple weeks ago we started our theme for the year, which is for such a time as this, which hopefully reminds you of what verse? Esther 4:14, right? B, yes, all right. So, and we're talking about living in this culture, the culture we live in, the situation we live in, the time we live in, that we are put here. Mordecai in Esther 4:14, Mordecai comes to Esther and he says, who knows, right? Who knows whether you have attained royalty? Basically, she becomes queen. We're going to read about today. And he's saying whether you became queen for this moment. Well, we understand a little bit more fuller theology. God has placed you in this moment because you are meant for this moment, right? God didn't make any accidents. You are here. You may not like some of the things. You may wish you had already gone to heaven, but you are here for a reason, for such a time as this. And so that's our theme for this year. We're talking about our first sermon series in that theme is we're not in Kansas anymore. And so that's a hark back to, if you're familiar with the movie, right, Wizard of Oz, and that you transported somewhere else that's not home. And so we spent a couple weeks ago talking about how our culture has shifted, and we went up until 1994. Some people think that we had a culture that was accepting of Christianity, and then from 94 to 14, it was kind of tolerant or ambivalent, and then that society in 2014 has turned where it's contrary to biblical values. And so whether you would agree or disagree, that's all right, but we're kind of saying, how do we engage in a culture that went from mostly Christian and pro-Christian to where it's not? And for some of you who are in the older than 40 crowd, that makes sense to you, right? You might look back and say, I can't believe how things have changed, right? Our country, I don't know where that phrase came from. Our country is going to hell in a handbasket. I don't know where that came from, and we said because of the shift in our culture, some of us younger people, I'm throwing me in there, although I'm not, right? But if you're 40 or under, right, you may hear us older people and you're like, what are you talking about? Why are you whining so much, right? Because you only grew up in that culture where it had moved away from Christ and biblical values already. And so you only grew up in that. So we're talking about we're not in Kansas anymore. And there's a verse in the Bible where Paul's writing, he says, we are not ignorant of the schemes of the devil. And so this series, we're just kind of taking a step back and we're looking at Esther and Daniel because those were both written to times where the audience, the Jewish people, were in the minority culture. They went from the majority culture to a minority culture. And so how do we engage in society? How do we function? What strategies does Satan have? And so today, last week was on trials and tribulations. Today we're on one of society's goals is to isolate and separate. And this is part one. We're going to circle back next week and kind of return to this theme. We are, just a side note, we are now posting sermons, and so right, you can go back and catch the beginning of the series, the beginning of the themes, or part one or part two as we post them sometime in the middle of the week. So let's read. Now let me just like with last week, let me just say these are emotional issues. These are tough issues we're talking about because that's what Satan does. That's what society does, right? And so we're touching them from the pulpit, but it's hard to get very intimate or personal. And I understand when we talk about this situation, it's very real for some of you. Some of you feel very isolated, very alone. You would say very lonely, right? And so there's lots of terms we could mix in here. You feel like you just don't belong. You're just not a part of anything, right? More so than you have in the past. And you wonder, why is that? What's changed? What's wrong with me? Why can't I connect? Why can't I engage well with people? And I just want to step back today because we're going to come into the story. And I want you to understand it's a strategy I think it's a strategy of Satan. We don't see that in the story of Esther. But I think it's what society does to us when we are the minority, we're not the majority, we're the minority culture, there's this push that we don't even notice. So let's read Esther chapter 2, starting in verse 1. So after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti, that was his wife that he had banished because of various reasons. In chapter 1, he had made basically an improper request of her. She refused. He didn't know what to do with that, so he banished her. Some people say maybe he killed her, but most likely if you read the text, he just banished her. And what she had done and what had been decreed against her, then the king's attendants who served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom." And we saw in chapter 1, it's a very broad kingdom, 127 provinces, right? So he had conquered and conquered and conquered and conquered. So his entire known kingdom, let the king appoint overseers in all provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, in the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. And then let the young lady who pleases the king become queen, or be queen, in place of Vashti. And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. So we didn't spend a lot of time this last week, but this is not a good king, right? He's not a godly man, right? And so he's like, yeah, that sounds great to me. Let's just find the most beautiful women, virgin women, and bring them in, and I can sleep with all of them and decide what I want, right? I mean, it's not a godly thing. As I said last week, this is not a Hallmark movie story, right? This is not, we like to make it all glamorous, but it's not, right? And for many people, Esther being one of those, had a residue of Jewish teaching, right? Entering into a relationship with somebody who's not her husband, who may or may not become her husband, was not a great idea, right? And so of course the king, right, we see him kind of as not the brightest, right? And the matter pleased the king. Well, of course it did, right? If you make up your own rules and do whatever you want, it sounds like a good deal. Now there was at the citadel of Susa a Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had taken into exile from Jerusalem. So he was one of the ones in exile, now minority culture, right? With the captives who had been exiled, with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. That just sets the historical setting for us. And he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful in form and face, and when her mother and father died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about when the command and the decree of the king was heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa in the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady, talking about Esther, now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, and he quickly provided for her cosmetics and food, and gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. And Esther did not make known her people or her kindreds. She was a Jew. Esther is not a Jewish name. She'd hid the fact that she was Jewish, right? And for Mordecai had instructed her that she would not make known them. And every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. And now when the turn of each young lady came to go into the king Ahasuerus after the end of their 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and cosmetics for women. The young lady would go into the king in this way. Anything she desired was given her to take with her for the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgar, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines, and she would not go again into the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So this kind of just paints the story for us, right? And we're going to dig into a specific part of this, but it appears they grabbed all of these people into the harem, and then all these young ladies, virgin young ladies, and they spent a year in a beautification process. Esther says that this lady found favor, right, of the chief of that harem, but they would come into the king, and then they would go into this other group where they were held as concubines, and then the king could call them at his will. And so there is this story. It mentions here that it seems that part of the process was basically when you came from the harem and you went to the king and then you went to be a concubine, whatever you brought with you, you would take with you. And so a lot of the women outside, extra biblical would say that they would come loaded with all the jewels they could, a ring on every finger and all the necklaces they could have. I mean, they were blinged up so that they could take everything, and then that became their possession when they went to concubine. And we'll see later, Esther doesn't do that. She comes very simple, and so I think the king senses her heart. She becomes queen, which will get us to where we're in chapter 4. But here's what we want to do. I want to look at a process that we see in Esther and Daniel, and it's in Esther, more so in Daniel. And it's 3 steps. And this, I tried to choose my words carefully. So here's the first one. What we see is they have these ladies from all different parts of the country, right? All the different provinces, and basically they want to make them queen worthy, right? And it mentions some of the beautification process, but it wasn't just beautification, right? They went to, whatever it is, finishing school, etiquette school. They were taught probably the ways of the people, the ways of the land. So what happened is they were taken from the society they were at. They were placed in another group, and then they were schooled, educated, trained, informed in the ways of that land. Does that make sense? So they were degrouped, regrouped, and re-educated. Okay? They were, and I know you might say degroup's not a word, but it might be. I don't know. So ungroup on your computer, if you ungroup something, that's a real word, right? So they were removed from where they were. And then they were put into a different group of people who shared different values and different ideas. And then they were basically re-educated. We might say today they were indoctrinated. We might say they were taught, they were informed. But basically there's a strategy here, right? And this is a real strategy. If you want to change somebody's behavior, you degroup, regroup, and re-educate. That make sense? Matter of fact, if somebody is an addict, one of the things they will do is they will have in-house treatment. And what they do is the first thing, if you're going to go to addiction therapy in order to change your behavior, and it's in-house, you do what? You degroup, right? We want to take that person out of the situations and the people who are influencing them. We want to put them in a group of our control, and then we want to re-educate them. We want to teach them and train them and inform them of things that are happening. So let's go to Daniel. We see this even more clearly in the book of Daniel. So Daniel chapter 1, and it sets kind of the chronological phase for us. But I'm going to start in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to Shinar, to the house of his gods, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his gods. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring some of the sons of Israel, including some of his royal family and of the nobles, youth in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding, discerning knowledge, who had the ability for serving in the king's court. So they bring them in, and then it says, they took them from Israel, brought them to the new kingdom, and then they re-educate them. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Now that wasn't, right, it's not just language, it's literature, right? And of course language matters, right? So when you teach somebody language, you're teaching more than just verbs and nouns. It's a culture, right? So it's language and literature. And the king appointed them, verse 5, a daily ration the king's choice food and the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated, there it is, educated 3 years, and at the end of which they would enter the king's personal service. Yeah. So I'm going to read, if you're still in Daniel 1, I'll just read verse 9. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion. So it is interesting. Esther, we said we don't see God mentioned in Esther, but we see God working in Esther, right? So Esther found favor. Daniel specifically says God caused Daniel to find favor, right? So we see that happening. But I just want you to see 3 years. They degrouped them from Jerusalem, right? And they said, you are the best of the best, but we need to re-educate you, right? So we're going to put you in this group with other people we've kidnapped from other areas, and we're going to re-educate you, right? So they degrouped, and they regrouped, and they re-educated. Now, again, this is not just a negative thing. We do this positively. Nehemiah did this same thing. Nehemiah, they was rebuilding the walls, and they had people who lived outside of the city, and they were very close to the enemy, and the enemy was saying, hey, we're going to attack you, we're going to attack you, we're going to attack you. And so the people were freaking out. And what did Nehemiah do? He said, you need to move into the city limits, right? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to change the group you associate with. And in changing the group you associate with, we're going to change the message you hear. Today we might talk about messaging. You get a message all the time, right? Message. And so change what you're messaging, and then bring you in, and we're going to encourage you, wrap you around other people, right? So again, this is a standard thing. Now, here's why this relates to us. Some of you, and again, mostly older people who came from when this was a predominant Christian nation, you'd say, I haven't been degrouped. I don't know what you're talking about. I've not been degrouped, right? But what has happened is society has changed around us such that basically, functionally, we are no longer in the same Christian grouping that you might have been, and you have now become part of a different culture. You have functionally been degrouped in order to be regrouped and re-educated, because the messages you hear today are constant, right? Everybody remember there's that story, I don't know if this was real, of the boiling frog? Raise your hand if you ever heard the boiling frog story. Come on, raise your hand if you heard the boiling frog story. So apparently you can boil a frog to death if you put him in water and you gently, gradually turn up the water. The frog won't notice it because it's gradual, and you could boil him alive. I don't know who would ever do that experiment. That's wrong, right? Don't do that home, right? But apparently when things happen gradually, when things happen slowly, you don't notice it, right? And so we're just stepping back a little bit, looking at our culture and saying, this has happened to us. We have been gradually pulled away from the Christian message, gradually put into a different environment, and the messaging that you hear now constantly is not really in line with what would have been taught 50, 60 years ago that the Bible teaches. Now, I always feel a sense of compassion for those who are younger than the 40, right? Because you grew up in this time period where it's really hard for you to decide what is true, right? It's really hard for a sincere, authentic follower of Christ in this day and age, if you grew up in this day and age, because some people say one thing and other people say another thing. And how do you sort it out, right? And so I think one of the ways is, right, if a doctrine that the church is teaching is brand new, right, if there's a new message that's out there over the last 10 years, you should be suspicious of it, right? But let's talk about, so degroup, regroup, re-educate. And here's what happens. We either give in or we feel isolated, right? And so for us, if society has changed around you, and it is no longer really a Christian society, and your interactions are really no longer based upon Christian values, you do one of two things. You either give in. You either say, I'm going to adopt that message, I'm going to be re-educated, or else you feel isolated. You feel like you don't belong. You feel like you're an outsider because you are. That's what I'm telling you. That's okay, right? Because there's this strategy that moves you to the peripheral because society has changed, right? So let's talk a little bit more. Our society changes or pressure. So we've been talking about this last couple weeks, right? The number of people who identify as Christians in our society, and again, I'm just talking in America, even the Western America, right? There's fewer Christians, right? The people who identify as Christians, or the people who attend church regularly, people who read the Bible, any of those categories have dropped down, right? So there are fewer Christians. And I think the second thing we see is that our society has become more secular. We've seen that for decades. People talk about the secularization of our society, and that means we focus less on the sacred things, and we focus more on the secular or worldly or temporary things. Make sense? So we've talked a little bit about that. When we focus more on the secular, one of the things that we see is we're less big picture and we're more granular. We lose some of those big high-level philosophical discussions, right? Because we no longer share we no longer care, right? The secular society cares about how am I going to pay the bills? What am I going to do next week? What am I going to do for a job? How am I going to do this? Right? Secular society cares about this moment and these little details. And so philosophical issues really lose their merit because all we're thinking about is practical. We want to be practical. How do we apply this? So it's very granular, right? And it's more about opinion than truth. Now that's really more of a function of postmodernism if we want to split the hair, but I don't think anybody cares if we're splitting that hair, right? So secular society really cares less about the truth and more about opinion. Every once in a while, have you ever seen this show, Judge Judy? Have you seen Judge Judy? Yeah, there you go. Or seen it online or commercials. Every once in a while, there'll be an ad for it, and it says, she's a judge in the courtroom, and she makes some decisions. But one of the things that she says is my opinion is the only one that matters, right? And that's, I think, such a great tagline for our society. My opinion, right? It doesn't matter what truth is. My opinion is the only one that matters, right? And so we have moved from that. I think another thing we see in our society is there a focus on differences. So as things become very granular, as we lose the big philosophical topics, what is the meaning of life, right? What is the purpose of man? As we lose those, say, is it wrong to cheat on your taxes? Is it wrong to go 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, right? The more those granular minutia dominates our thinking, we focus on differences. And the more society becomes granular, the more differences there are. Does that make sense? So all this, I'm just trying to explain this whole setting because society, the way society is geared right now, it is geared to make us feel alone. It is designed to make us feel alone. Like you don't fit in, like you don't belong, like nobody sees life the way you do. You're unique, that you're odd, right? Which you might be odd, but because we all are odd, right? Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example from politics. If you ever hear anything in our society about politics, and you might have lately, right? Because we have an election. I think we're 3 weeks away from an election, right? And of course, society wants to paint everything, what? 2 categories. Yeah, black and white, Democrat and Republican, right? So let's take 5. I'm going to take 5 topics. 5 topics from politics, okay? Stay with me here. Abortion, issues of the environment, family, parental rights, the economy, and gun safety. Okay, so it's just 5 topics. And it's interesting, this is a later slide, but I don't think I have it. Do you know the Republican Party has 63 platform topics, and the Democratic Party has 57 topics. So we're taking 5 out of 63, 57, right? 5 out of 60. Let's just for our illustration, let's just mention these, right? So these are buzzwords we hear, right? We hear these in the news with people who are about abortion. So let's take one of these, though. So let's just take gun safety. That's not just a topic, right? There's several sections under a topic, right? So when you talk about gun safety, you might say, well, what do I think about background checks, right? What do you think about a waiting period before you get a gun, right? And so what do you think about the type of guns and automatic weapons and the amount of ammo in a clip, right? And so red flag laws, that's an issue, right? And storing a gun, safely storing your gun, right? There's laws for that. And right, I don't know why this was on my brain this week, other than there was a case in Spokane about somebody who showed up in school with a gun and nobody knows where the kid got it, or I don't know. I'm sure somebody does, right? So I'm taking 5 out of 60 topics, and each topic really has a whole iteration of sections, right? And you're really not yes or no, right? We often think everything is black and white, yes or no. If somebody beats their girlfriend and goes to jail, post bail, they get out the next day, I don't think any of us are going to say that guy should be able to, on his way home from the police station, stop by and buy a gun and walk out with a gun, right? I think we're all going to say that would be crazy, right? But it's not a yes or no. We're going to say, well, what should happen? How long should they wait? What, right? So even if on this topic we were to say there's not a yes, no, let's just give 3 choices, right? So 5 topics, 4 sections, and there's probably 3 choices, okay? Do you know how many scenarios that creates? 5 topics, 4 sections, 3 viewpoints creates, anyone want to make a guess? 1,000. I have 1,000. I have 1,000,000. What do you think? Anybody else? Huh? A lot. A lot's right. 3,486,000,000 options. And we talked about 5 issues of a 63 issue platform, or 57. Five topics, 4 sections, right? Do you think you're going to find somebody who thinks the way you do on just these 5 topics? You're going to have to spend the rest of your life interviewing a whole bunch of people, right? And let's hope that your opinions don't change, right? Between now and when you find that 1 in 3.4 billion person. And why do I mention that? Just because society pushes upon us this idea that, well, people should agree with you. We should focus on differences. And if I'm worried about people who are different than me, then I need to look for somebody who's the same as me. And finding somebody who's the same as you is impossible. Society is currently, and the more fragmented our society gets, which is moving that direction, the more fragmented our society gets, the more isolated and separate we will feel. By design. Does that make sense? It's not their fault. It's not your fault. Society is geared because you're part of a group, a follower of Christ, you're part of a group, and there's fewer, so as you interact, you notice that aloneness. There's now no longer discussions of the big topics. It's now little itty-bitty topics, and when you get to little itty-bitty topics, there's a whole lot more of those, and so we talk about differences, and it's impossible, right? And this isn't just politics, right? I hear sometimes people say, nobody agrees with my theology. In church, right, we talk about theology, right? Well, we can do the same thing with theology, right? We can put up 5 topics and say, you think any of us are going to agree? The more you worry about, are you pre or post-trib, right? Are you amillennial or whatever, right? The more you worry about that, you're never going to find your identical twin, right? So we've got to get past that, and we've got to push back up into the bigger topics. Now, let me just mention one more thing. I think we see it a lot in our society today. We live in a very digital world, right? So you've probably heard study after study after study that says the more time somebody spends online, the more isolated they feel. And so there's theories and there's ideas about why. Some people think that it's what's called causation, that spending time online causes feelings of isolation or aloneness. I think it's more causal. I think it's more correlated, that something's going on that creates this correlation. And so, right? And again, I just say that because you need to understand there's nothing wrong. I'm not saying don't get online. I'm not saying don't ever, right, check your email or don't ever surf the web, right? I'm just saying you need to understand there's a trade-off. The more you are online, the more isolated you're going to feel for some reason, right? And I think there's lots of reasons, but that's just a reality that is out there in our society. So, this is part one, right? I really struggled about ending here before we really talk about some solutions. But I think the important thing for you to understand is there is this process in society that has happened around you. You don't know you've been degrouped, but I'm telling you, if you're over 50 and you've been a Christian your whole life, basically you're no longer in that same group, right? It's been degrouped around you. And in the degrouping, you've been regrouped, right? And so there's all these messages that happen that we just don't realize. And I just want you to understand, things are stacked against us right now. Society is trying to move us from those groups we were part of, put us in other groups, and then re-educate us, revalue us into things. And we've got to be careful with that, right? We've got to just be aware of that. Because otherwise, if I'm feeling isolated, I think it's your fault, right? Because you're not doing enough, or maybe I'm not doing enough, right? And there's things we can do. We'll talk about some pieces next week. But I just want us to understand that. So I think, let me give one more piece of warning here. I think currently we're seeing a resurgence of conservatism. And so you might have conservative groups that reach out to you who say, you know what, look at what's going on in our society. We should fight against that and move against that. And so here's what you should do, right? And so I want you to understand they have the same strategy, right? They want you to be in a different group, but they still have a group, right? And I think it's important for us to realize the group we want to be a part of is group Jesus, right? Group Jesus, right? We don't want to just be a part of the group that is, well, we're the moral group, we're the legalistic group, right? We're the group who returns to this or that. That's one of my pet peeves, right? I get several things about politics, right? And it annoys me how little they talk about person's individual walk with Christ. When in the Old Testament, that was the thing. You either followed God or you didn't, and that was good king or bad king, right? Again, because our society has become so granular, all we think about is what? What policies do they support? Do I like the policies that they support, right? Nadine gave me a magazine yesterday. It was a great quote in there. It's from a guy, Kevin DeYoung, and he said, in the Old Testament, God was less concerned that people figure out how to change a godless empire and more concerned that his people not be conformed to the godless empire in which they lived. I thought that was great. And it was, here's the thing. Society is constantly pushing you. And today we're talking about one of the things it is. It wants you to feel alone. It wants you to feel all by yourself. It wants you to feel isolated, that there's nobody who thinks the same way as you do. There's nobody who sees things the same way as you do. Until you can find that 1 in 3.4 billion person, you are doomed to be alone. And I'm saying that is not true. And I just today want to give you that little bit of hope that it's not true. All right, last week we handed out dominoes, and we're having an application theme of own your domino, right? And so if you lost yours or didn't get one or new this week, there are dominoes out in the entryway. Grab a domino. The takeaway from last week was which way are you facing, right? Or who do you face? And so think about your domino, and you put dominoes in a stack. Which way do you face, right? And last week we said one of our big problems is self-reliance. And so you're either victim or victor. A victim thinks about how they're supposed to be self-reliant, but they just don't have what it takes. So, poor me, right? If you do have what it takes, woo, rock on you, right? But both of those are all about you, you being strong enough. And what we really should be are vessels, and so we really should be God-reliant. So we just gave out dominoes, said, carry this with you. Think about which way are you facing, right? You just need to flip it over. Not be self-focused, be God-focused. And so next week, Steve, carry that with you this week. I'm not giving you a new question to ponder as you hold it. We'll get that next week. So, all right. Let's pray. Father God, I just thank you for your love and care for us. And Father, many people will talk about loneliness, anxiety that comes with loneliness, identity issues as just being rampant today. And Father, I think as followers of Christ, as followers, sincere followers of Christ, society is geared to make us feel alone, to feel isolated, because that's a strategy that we see in Scripture. And so I just pray that we would be aware of that. We would realize that there's hope. And things are broken, but they're broken for all of us. Thank you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Amen.